I've already provided one lecture on Civil War memory, and I'm going to do a second one today, partially because this one's going to be on Florida, and secondly because this is a lecture that changes most. You know, when I talk about Gettysburg, what I was talking about 10 years ago, 15 years ago in Gettysburg hasn't changed a whole lot. But a lecture on Confederate memory literally changes day by day, it seems like, this summer. I mean, we're in a part where we're talking about statues being removed, names being taken off of buildings, etc. And so I want to look at this, sort of the Civil War tradition of memory, and there have been multiple traditions of memory over time, but the one that probably is most influential, certainly most influential in putting up statues, was the Lost Cause version. Lost Cause version depicted in the movie Gone with the Wind. You know, here it is, the famous quote: "There was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen the knights and their ladies fair, of master and slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind." And the idea here, of course, is a romanticized view of the Old South. As the white men were gallant, slaves were loyal. And then the idea of the lost cause is not simply that the South was to be, this was a romanticized view of the antebellum, the pre-war South. It was also a situation where these people fought bravely. They were outnumbered and they lost despite their hard fighting. And then after that, they fought for a cause they believed in, and then all should be forgiven. So John Brown Gordon, who was a Confederate general, epitomized this. Look at this. Read this quote here. When he tells me and my Southern comrades that teaching our children that the cause for which they fought and our comrades died is all wrong, I must earnestly protest. In the name of the future manhood of the South, I protest. What are we to teach them? If we cannot teach them that their fathers were right, it follows these Southern children must be taught that they were wrong. I will never be ready to have my children taught that I was ever wrong, or that the cause of my people was unjust and unholy. Oh, my friends, you were right, but we were right too. So, a couple things here. As a father, I definitely appreciate the idea that my children should never, ever, ever think that I'm wrong. Okay, maybe not, that's not the case. But more importantly here is that this view says both sides were right. The South fought for what they believed, and the North fought what they believed. And certainly you see a lot of that from people who are defending Confederate flags or statues. It's both sides fought for what they believed in. And so this sort of also epitomized this lost cause that everybody, it wasn't that the North was wrong, it was that both sides somehow in this equation were right. And this is a Civil War tradition that carried on for at least 100 years, epitomized by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Actually, when you look at a lot of monuments that were put up in the North, and on Civil War battlefields that were put up by the U.S. government, state governments. Well, Southern governments were in bad financial shape, not surprisingly, after the Civil War ended, and certainly up into the turn of the century, into the 20th century. In some ways, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, people whose literally fathers had fought in the war, had relatives fought in the war for the South, they became a big fundraiser. And so a lot of the statues you see in the South were put up by the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. We're going to see that here in Florida Civil War battlefield. And that partially plays a controversy now because when a private entity pays for something, how can you change its name? How can you take it away, even if it's 100 years later? And that's one of the questions that we're being forced to deal with today. I've already showed this slide because I think this slide is very important, particularly when it comes to school namings. School namings in gray, as I mentioned, in this decade here in the 1950s and 1960s, in some cases, in reaction to Brown versus Board of Education, is when you see a lot of Southern schools named after Confederates. But since the 1960s, we moved from a lost cause to an emancipationist legacy. The Civil War is going to focus on, this is all from the movie Glory, the Massachusetts 54th. It's a very good movie that does sort of bring up this idea of United States colored troops, the USCT. It brings up this idea that the Civil War was about emancipation and that African Americans helped in emancipation, sort of ties into this argument of who freed the slaves. And in this legacy, it does focus on not only the Civil War was a war about emancipation. Emancipation was the right thing to do, and if it was the right thing to do, then what the South did was the wrong thing to do. It was not a question of you were right and we were right. I think in the emancipationist legacy, it clearly indicates that the North was right, abolitionism was right, and people who opposed abolitionism were wrong. And so given that, there becomes a movement against this lost cause legacy. Here's an example of a school in Florida. Jacksonville is probably sort of I guess if the place that has the most Confederate statues and Confederate symbols in Florida is Jacksonville. Here they have an example, Nathan Bedford Forrest High School, named I think in the late 50s. So here it is, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was not only a Confederate cavalryman, but before the war had traded slaves. After the war, reputedly is the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, he is like the epitome of the unrepentant South. And so here in Jacksonville, which has no connection to Nathan Bedford Forrest, he's from Memphis, Tennessee. As far as I know, he never even came to Florida. Decides in the 1950s, early 1960s, to name a school for him. In the early 2000s, maybe around 2010, took about a decade or so. That school is renamed Westside High School. And you're seeing a lot of that going on right now, the renaming of high schools. I know there's controversies over Robert E. Lee High Schools. In Orlando, there were two high schools, I believe, or two schools named for Confederates. There was a Robert E. Lee High School established in the 1950s that has subsequently moved from a high school to a middle school and is now College Park Middle School. The one that still exists is Stonewall Jackson Middle School. Actually, I thought the name had already changed, but it has not changed. Stonewall Jackson Middle School in Orlando, they pretty much decided to rename Stonewall Jackson Middle School Jackson Middle School. So I guess in that case, you could have picked any Jackson that you wanted to name after Michael Jackson, Samuel L. Jackson, could have been anybody named Jackson, Andrew Jackson, or Stonewall Jackson. So it's just going to be the Jackson Middle School. But I think some people now think that has not gone far enough. Particularly if Jackson Middle School was still located on Stonewall Jackson Drive, which is the name of the street it's on, then it still seems to commemorate Stonewall Jackson. So I think right now we're at a standstill. Essentially, the move to rename Stonewall Jackson Middle School seems to have failed, and I think now there's going to be some sort of more dramatic name change away from Jackson Middle School. Now, the defenders of most of these, or the opponents of most of these name changes, you can feel for them. If you went to school, whatever high school you went to, you identify with it. So would you really like to go back and find out your high school's name has changed? And you can see that people take that personally. I think that's really what you see most of the defenders here doing. Not that they want to revere Stonewall Jackson, but if I went to Stonewall Jackson Middle School, do I want its name to disappear from memory? And I think that's really, so again, we have memory, this personal connection to this that shapes people's view of this decision. But my guess is within the next year or so, Stonewall Jackson Middle School's name will change. In fact, they say partly it's the coronavirus that has slowed this change because they're trying to get community input, and that, of course, it's hard to get the community together these days. So we'll see what happens there. A lot of this change came in the wake of the 2015, where Dylan Roof shoots up an African American, murders African Americans in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. You see some of these statues being removed. This is Lee Circle in New Orleans, one of the most prominent Confederate statues. Lee was removed in 2015 or maybe early 2016 in reaction to this. So we talk about removing statues today. That trend had sort of started already before. To the Florida side, the most important, biggest battle in Florida is at Olustee. Olustee is up in the northeast part of Florida in Baker County. Most of you probably have not heard of Olustee, but it is the largest battle in Florida, which I guess is kind of like being the biggest tadpole or something like that. Well, Olustee battlefield had really got national traction about 7 years ago. Olustee is a battle in 1864. The Union troops are marching from Jacksonville to the west. They're stopped at Olustee. It's a Confederate victory. It's one of the last Confederate victories, even though it's a year before the war ends, one of the last major Confederate victories. Here, they're stopped. The Union troops are stopped at Olustee. There may or may not have been, probably were African-American prisoners executed at Olustee battlefield. Well, Olustee becomes a state battlefield. The state of Florida doesn't have a lot of money. So the United Daughters Confederacy, back to the UDC, set aside a small acreage of land for the official battlefield. And they established a Confederate monument there, which is what you see here on the left. Now, if you go to Olustee, there's the national battlefield, which is a few acres. There's a national forest I think it's probably to the north of that, which is where much of the battle was fought. And then sort of, if you're looking at this monument, if you turn to the left and look around, there's a private cemetery. And in the private cemetery is the only Union monument there. So it's not on that ground. Well, in the early 21st century, probably about a decade ago, and now a little bit closer, people fought to put a Union monument there. And they went through the process. They were at a state meeting, and these meetings, when you go to change things on a national park or a state park, no one ever shows up. In this case, 300 angry people showed up and said, no, you cannot put a Union monument on this ground. This ground belonged to the UDC. The UDC donated for a Confederate monument. They would not want a Union monument there. Plus, there's this Union monument sort of that you can't even, it's even hard to find. Actually, there's no signs indicating where the Union monument is. So you can't put a Union monument there. And what happened when this came up in 2013, 14, and 15, essentially the state legislature decided that this was too controversial a topic to address, so they just ignored it. And literally nothing has happened since then. It was a big issue, and they basically put it off, and they said, we're going to wait till 2017 report comes out. Now we're 3 years since then, and still nothing has happened. So even in a place, you can say statues belong in battlefields, but even here, there's a question of what kind of statues belong. Here in Lake Eola, for a long time, there was Johnny Reb here. Johnny Reb, a statue. So here you're looking at downtown Orlando across Lake Eola. And in 2000, so here at Confederate, talk about a lost cause mythology. The cause for which he suffered was lost. The people who he fought were crushed. Their hopes were shattered. His fame. So the Confederate soldier, the idea that this guy fought nobly. His cause might have been crushed. And it puts the name, I think, of people associated with Orlando who fought in the battle there. Well, what the City Council of Orlando does is that I think it's in early 2018, Johnny Reb is removed. And the first picture was an old picture of Johnny Reb because he still had his gun there, his rifle there. His rifle disappears at some point. So what the City Council decides to do is they remove him. He is moved to Greenwood Cemetery, and they also help refurbish him. They return his rifle to Johnny Reb. And it's done really without much controversy, without much fanfare. And so it moves it from a city park, Lake Eola, to a private, or to a cemetery, which seems to be a better place to commemorate fallen soldiers. More recent controversies associated with Florida involve Edmund Kirby Smith. As you may or may not know, every state has two statues in the U.S. Capitol for famous residents of the state, and it's really bizarre. If you had asked me a decade ago to name who were Florida's statues there, I would have had no idea, and I'm pretty sure most of you would not have known either. One guy's last name, I think his last name is Curry. I think it's John Curry. He's an early developer of what becomes air conditioning. And the other was Edmund Kirby Smith. Edmund Kirby Smith is a Confederate general. He primarily fought in the trans-Mississippi West, essentially Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, west of the Mississippi River. One of the last major generals, perhaps the last major general to surrender in the Civil War. Well, Edmund Kirby Smith was born in St. Augustine, had very little connection to the state aside from that, but he becomes one of Florida's statues. And Florida decides, again, since 2015, to change that statue. We've actually approved to put a Mary Bethune, so Bethune-Cookman's, an African-American woman statue in his place. Then the question becomes what to do with Edmund Kirby Smith's statue. And up until last week, 2 weeks ago, Lake County was going to take this statue and put it in its museum. Edmund Kirby Smith has none connection to Lake County, but the Lake County people decided they wanted that statue. I don't know if they're just trying to provoke people. It's really, it was ever unclear why they want it. Obviously, for their Civil War, it's a statue. It's a free. Who doesn't want a free statue? That has now changed in the wake of recent events, and now there's actually some discussion of putting the Edmund Kirby Smith statue at the Olustee battlefield. So we have to stay tuned. Like I said, this lecture changes constantly. You also have controversies over Confederate flags. This is the Confederate flag that's off of I-75 near I-4. One of the largest Confederate flags flies there next to the interstate. It has been taken down, at least temporarily right now. Obviously, the Confederate flag controversy also is associated with NASCAR, and Confederate flags had long been associated with the rebel nature of NASCAR, a sport that develops around moving stolen alcohol, or I guess illegal alcohol during Prohibition. This idea that these people are rebels who fought against the government, that's the NASCAR reputation. So it's a Southern sport. Confederate flags are ubiquitous were ubiquitous at NASCAR. NASCAR has finally decided that Confederate flags will not be welcome at NASCAR events. And clearly this last week at Talladega, there's some protest about whether Confederate flags can go outside the events, what's going to happen within the events. And again, like I said, Confederate memory, this is personal. People feel upset about these things on both sides of the issue. And that's why unlike Confederate history, Confederate memory changes consistently. I hope this provided you some insight on Confederate memory, particularly how it relates to Florida. Thank you.